I, I hope you had a pleasant and relaxing lunch, and you're all refreshed. And I hope during my presentation that if there is a God for technology, that He is smiling, so we don't have any more problems. Today is the second part of our presentation. We continue to address the theme we introduced yesterday of aligning literacy inside and outside of school. Yesterday, I outlined 3 conditions that justify the need for aligning literacy inside and outside of school. First, I established that the world is increasingly digital. Second, that reading, writing, and communication outside of school is likewise increasingly digital. And third, that much instruction in school still reflects the tools, the curriculum, the activities of a typographic era based on print and paper, rather than the accelerating demands of a post-typographic digital era. Then I presented some theoretical ideas that might give us foundational perspectives and understanding about the relation between technologies and writing and reading, specifically the affordances of digital texts that show them to be distinctly different from printed text. I also suggested a few implications of these differences for instruction. And I like this slide I found to kind of capture the flavor of our topic of jumping from that familiar bowl where we feel so comfortable to the new waters of the digital world. So today we're going to provide a few examples. I'm going to provide a few examples from my research, just so you get an idea of the kind of research we do and maybe a few findings that are relevant. And we want to focus more practically on how classrooms and schools might become more aligned with the digital world outside of classrooms. And then Emily, my doctoral student who I introduced to you yesterday, is going to speak to you about some practical instructional activities and approaches that link particularly writing outside of school with writing in school. And I think it will fit very nicely with Julie Coyro's presentation, because she focused mostly on reading, and Emily will be talking a little more about writing. And she is not only an excellent doctoral student who has a lot of knowledge in this area, she was a high school teacher, a secondary teacher of English. So she knows what it's like to be a teacher, moving from the familiar world of print to more of a digital frame. So just to give you an idea of the kind of questions that I address in my research. And I hope the translator will be able to translate these for you, because I didn't have these translated. Are the necessary conditions in place? We might call that the infrastructure of technology. And we've heard in the questions, and it's been very enlightening to us as speakers to hear some of the lack of infrastructure that many of you are facing in your schools. So you can't do these things. You can't move from that world of print to the world of the digital unless you have certain tools in place and certain kinds of support. And so in my research, that's the starting point. Are those fundamental tools, the equipment, the technology, the support, are they in place? What are teachers' attitudes, beliefs, perceptions about digital literacy? What do teachers now believe? Are those beliefs consistent with this transformation? And what are the obstacles that teachers believe stand in their way of moving from this typographic to post-typographic world. What are the conditions or characteristics that correlate with greater alignment? Can we say that teachers who have certain things, certain beliefs, certain attitudes, certain support available, is that predictive of how much they are actually integrating technologies into their instruction? And finally, how can digital literacy be integrated into instruction? How do we facilitate that? How can we make that happen in classrooms? So these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in addressing in my research. I put this slide again. If you remember, I used this slide yesterday. I want to start with looking in a little more detail at some of the findings from this national survey that I did with Amy Hutchison. And the first question that I put up just a minute ago was, is the infrastructure in place? And what we found is that at least in schools in the United States, all of the people who responded to our survey were practicing teachers in the area of literacy. It suggests that they do have, in large measure, many of the tools that they need. For example, we found that 92% of them reported having the internet available to them in their classroom. Actually, there are other data that suggest that the average in the United States is closer to 99%. So we asked, even though 92% is good, we wondered why the literacy teachers had somewhat less access. But this is not, this figure suggests that they do have access to the internet for their teaching. Let's see, I guess I can point here. They have, so this line shows that 92% have access to the internet in their classrooms. They have at least, or this is school and this is classrooms. They do have digital projectors, like are working part of the time today. They have interactive whiteboards. I think you know, I assume you have some of those here in Columbia. Laptops, then laptops for each student, very few. Now these data are a couple years old, so we suspect that that's increasing, but relatively few of the teachers had a laptop for every student or a tablet. We also found that the teachers had considerable technological support. This first bar indicates that a little over 73% of the teachers had at least a district technology coordinator that might help them. Library media specialists, that was mentioned earlier today, 70%. Another teacher is, there's a lot of teacher-to-teacher support, 48%, and then some of these other categories, I won't go through each one, indicate that there are many sources of support available for teachers. We also, just a little bit about their beliefs. This chart shows that we asked them in an open-ended way, just tell us what you think it means, or how would you define integrating digital literacy into instruction? And there are all kinds of answers, but the largest category, interestingly enough, was that 38% indicated that using presentation tools was an integral part of their definition of integrating technology into instruction. Or 23% said conducting research on topics, presumably on the internet. 20% said that their definition was either supplementing or replacing existing activities. On the other hand, 2 out of the 3 respondents in that category said that it was supplemental. So most of the teachers don't, in the United States at least, don't believe that technology should replace what they're doing, but to supplement what they are doing. And then here is the graph that I had up yesterday to remind you of a couple things that I mentioned. Remember, these bars show from 0, I either don't use or don't think are important at all, some of these categories that we had on the survey, versus a 4, which means to a great or a large extent. And again, remember, these are a few, just representative examples from the survey. But using reference sites online, the red bar indicates how many of the teachers thought that was important. The blue bar indicates how much they actually report the frequency of use. So as the point that I tried to make yesterday was that these things, using reference sites online, locating information online, creating a Word document, are all uses of technology that kind of supplement or extend what teachers already are doing in classrooms. And we call that technical integration. And the items down here, collaborating online with students from other classes, publishing information on a wiki or blog, synthesizing information online, that we would probably associate with more a movement towards integrating digital literacy in the classroom. The bars are all shorter. They think they're important, but not as important as some of these other tools that are more associated with what they have been doing. Now, this is maybe a little scary looking display. It's really not that. It represents a complex statistical analysis. And believe me, I don't understand all of the statistics behind this information. But we have people who work with us who understand them much better than we do. But it's really quite simple. It's called a path analysis, and it tries to associate factors that are related in some way. And this is a model we created and we tested statistically with the data from the survey. So we had information about the teachers, lots of information about how important they thought integrating technology was. And that is represented in this box over here. We had a measure that indicated how important they thought it was. This box on the other side represents how much they actually reported integrating the technology. So on one side we have beliefs about the importance of technology. On the other side we have extent of integration, how much they actually reported they were doing. Now, all of these things in here we call intermediary variables. Do these things figure into the relationship between these two, the perceived or importance or beliefs about importance and the extent of integration? Now, this red line, all the red lines, indicate statistical significance. Now, not always does statistical significance mean real significance, but it's a starting point for our thinking. So what we have here is this red line shows that statistically, the responses the teachers gave about perceived importance were statistically related to their extent of integration. So if you believe it's important, it's very simple. If you believe it's important, you're more likely to have more integration, okay? And if you are into statistics, this number down here, this 0.37, indicates that 37% of the variance in this, the extent of integration, was explained by perceived importance. And that's moderately high. So there is a relationship between these two things. Then the interesting part are these variables in between, and all the red lines, again, indicate some statistical significance. So teachers who thought they were competency, that's this box that I'm pointing to, were more likely to integrate technology into their instruction. Those who believed that there weren't that many obstacles to doing it also predicted extent of integration. The stance, if you have a positive stance towards technology, also predictive. And finally, of course, the availability of technology was a predictive factor. Now, just as interesting are two things here that are not predictive. This PD stands for professional development of teachers. Teachers who go to workshops, maybe even teachers who go to conferences like this. Those kinds of things were not as predictive. And that doesn't mean that they can't be. It just may mean that what is going on in those sessions are not particularly useful, okay? Now, we did a separate publication on part of our data because it was so important. We were asking, what do teachers believe are the obstacles, the barriers to integrating technology into their teaching? And this came, again, from the same set of data, the survey data. We also have repeated the same study in South Korea. I have a doctoral student who is from South Korea. He translated the survey into Korean, and we gave the same survey to teachers in South Korea. And we asked them what are their obstacles, along with some other things. And where did our list of obstacles come from? It came from a review of all of the studies, all the literature about what might be an obstacle to integrating technology in general into schools. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail, and here's another kind of, it's an interesting graph. And let me explain it. It's sometimes called a spider graph because it looks like a spider's web. And the lighter shades, first of all, around the side are all the possible obstacles that teachers might face. And I'm not going to read the whole list. But these are all obstacles that teachers, the literature said may be an obstacle, and then we asked them to what extent are these obstacles. The farther you get away from the center of the spider web, the greater the obstacle, according to the teachers who responded. But one thing that's interesting, these are the teachers in the U.S., the lighter shaded line, and these are the teachers in South Korea. Notice that the patterns are fairly different. And one thing that becomes clear, and maybe is an important point to make here, is that there are cultural differences from one culture, one country to another. So it would be interesting to see what kind of pattern would emerge if we did this in Colombia. In fact, if there are any researchers or doctoral students out here who would like to do a study like that, you are welcome to use our survey, and you would just have to translate it into Spanish. It would be interesting, and maybe next time we get together, we'll have another shade here and see, and it would be interesting to see. But knowing that will be very helpful. There was a question yesterday, how can we help teachers move? Well, if we kind of know what they see as the obstacles, what their beliefs are, that's a starting point for helping them, okay? By the way, we are now currently, almost probably while I'm talking right now, the student is working with a colleague in South Korea where we're following up with what we call focus group interviews with small groups of teachers to probe a little more behind the data. There are really some interesting cultural, political things going on in South Korea that I'm learning about. It's very interesting, and how we explain some of the differences in the responses. Okay, now I want to shift. How am I doing? Okay. I have to leave Emily enough time because I know you're going to be really interested in what she has. This is all the research stuff she's going to give you, especially if you're a teacher interested in practical ideas. She's going to give you some. I do another kind of research. I do a particular kind of research, and I want to tell you a little bit about that research so you can understand what we did in classrooms. There are two metaphors for conventional approaches to doing educational research. One is the laboratory, and that's where we do experiments. We do this, we try this approach, and then we try another approach, and have a control group. Just like in a laboratory, you set up an experiment, and you see which is best, which comes out on top. Was this more effective than that? The other metaphor for research and education is the lens. This is the qualitative approach, where you examine very carefully and try to understand a context and what's going on. And those are very valid and useful ways of doing research. On the other hand, I don't believe they're the most productive way to give us the kind of information about how we make things work in classrooms. So I am one of a lot of people, a growing number of people in the educational research community that are looking for a new way to do research. And the way to give you a little bit of an idea about that research is to introduce this new metaphor. It's the metaphor of engineering, designing things. Engineers try to make things that work, and they have failures and they correct, and they're changing until they get a product that works or a device that works. And this is the metaphor for the approach I use in my research. I try to design things working with teachers to accomplish a goal. And what I learn is what happens when there are things that are barriers and obstacles to accomplish, and what must I do to change, and why does that work? So I'm like an engineer trying to make something work. And what I learn as a researcher is when things sometimes don't go well, or when they do, and I try to understand why. Here's another way of capturing that type of research. In conventional experimental research, the laboratory metaphor, you ask a question like, what is best on average most of the time? All things being equal, which thing works best across a lot of different contexts? And that may be useful information, but it doesn't help you necessarily as a teacher who may have students who may be in a situation where the average doesn't work. A qualitative approach, on the other hand, sort of says, what's happening? And it doesn't really try to get in and change anything or make something work, it's just what's going on. Design-based research, using that metaphor of an engineer, asks, what could be? We want something good to happen. So how can we make it happen? How can we achieve a valued goal? Now, I use what I call a formative experiment. And it's a kind of approach to design-based research. And I want to give you just a couple examples. This article actually just came out a couple weeks ago. But like many published articles, the work was done like 2 years ago. It's entitled Obstacles to Developing Digital Literacies on the Internet in Middle School Science Instruction. And we've started to work in the content areas. Many of you teach reading and writing, what we would call language arts teachers. We started working with subject area teachers in science, and in a minute I'll show you a study we did in social studies. But this study was done in a middle school science classroom. And consistent with this approach to research, design-based research, We don't start with a research question per se. We start with a goal. And that's what drives our research. How do we get to that goal? And our goal in this case was to increase students' ability to find and evaluate information on the internet. And then we have an intervention, some instructional activity, some approach that we can justify, we think is a promising start to get to our goal. And I want to thank Julie because she told you all about internet reciprocal teaching, if you remember, in her talk, which is the intervention that we used. And it's no accident because, as Julie said, we worked ago on a project that studied that intervention. So we were trying to do it in a science classroom. One of the reasons we moved into the subject areas in the United States, we found that often language arts teachers are so concerned about standardized tests that they don't want to make room for some of these innovative activities. And so we're looking for an opportunity to integrate it into the subject areas like science. Briefly, internet reciprocal teaching is modeled after, as Julie said, reciprocal teaching, students working in small groups, talking to each other about their strategies. The teacher is not, doing little mini lessons. We were doing the same thing in this classroom. Just as an example of one of our findings, and I'll read this to you, and I hope the translator can translate for you. We look for factors that inhibit progress towards our goal, and what are factors that enhance progress towards our goal. And we try to capitalize on those factors that enhance, and we try to neutralize or circumvent those factors that inhibit. And then we make changes based on that data. But one of the things that came out of this study, and I think it's one of the few studies that have been published in all of education research that focused on not having success. And, engineers experience failure and embrace it because it helps them learn and make something better. In education research, we typically always want success, and we want to not be bothered with the failure. But in this article, we said these are some really important obstacles, and this is not the whole list. These are the important obstacles to achieving our goal. And knowing how difficult a task is sometimes very important to accomplishing what you want to accomplish. Just acknowledging, and I think Julie, what she was presenting shows how it's difficult for these changes to happen and for teachers to embrace them. So the inhibiting factor that I just gave is one example from our research, is students could explain and demonstrate strategies they were taught, all these strategies for evaluating and finding information on the internet, but they did not use them in their independent work. If you asked them, what should you do when you go on the internet to find information? Oh, well, you taught us we should do this, we should do that. But then we watched them when they were doing their school tasks. They weren't doing those things. One of the implications of that, if you try to assess, was my intervention successful, and you do some kind of, they know they're being assessed, they'll do it. But what good does that do if when you're not around, they're not using those approaches? So what were some of the obstacles that we identified along with that inhibiting factor? Okay, I'm almost done. Teachers provided useful and reliable sites for students, and this is a theme in campus. So the teacher, and we talked about that earlier, well, what should I do, teacher? Well, this is what you should do. Because the teacher was trying to be helpful. And in this case, the teacher was not being helpful, but was inhibiting the students actually using this in their independent work. Okay? We talk about in the United States about classroom management, and usually it's disciplining students who are misbehaving. When I talk to teachers, I say, part of classroom management is managing your own behavior and doing what is in the best interest of students, even if it's not sometimes what you would do automatically or intuitively. Another inhibiting factor was inquiry projects framed as searches for correct answers. If the teacher says, well, I use inquiry methods, but the way she framed the task was just go out there and find the right answer and you're done. Well, that does not promote independent use of these strategies on the internet. And then students reverted to strategies used outside of school because they're doing their hobbies and whatever, and some of these strategies don't make sense when you're doing non-academic tasks. Okay? Now, we do generate theory in this approach, and one of the theoretical understandings, and we call them humble theories, or pedagogical theories, and that is a very important principle that came out of our study in what we found is the principle of least effort. That students will maximize their grades, finish the task, do what the teacher asked them to do with the least possible effort. And if you frame tasks that what you have to acknowledge that as a teacher, that students always will get we're all that way. That's actually an economic principle. We maximize our gains, minimizing the input. Okay, I'm going to stop because I want to give Emily enough time. There's another study we did in a social studies classroom. If some of you have any interest in that, you can talk to me later. So, Emily? Oh, this is her first presentation as a doctoral student in a foreign country.
Hola. Hola, mi nombre es Emily. I work with Dr. Reinking at Clemson, and I also work on a grant delivering professional development to teachers, specifically on writing instruction, and the grant pertains to schools in rural areas. So I was excited to hear we have some teachers in rural areas here today. Before that, I worked as a writing and reading teacher at the middle school, the high school, and the collegiate level. So I have a little bit of experience with writing, and that's what I want to talk to you today, but also integrate it with what you've been hearing about over the conference. Daniel and Julie talked to you about honoring the types of digital literacies and tools that students are using outside of school, and I'll be talking about that same thing. But you noticed on some of Julie's slides, as she was talking about those complex literacy tasks that we asked students to do, and she had that great pyramid of tasks, she's focused on the synthesizing and evaluating of those sources, which is very important. But you also may have noticed that on each of those steps in the pyramid, there was asking students to communicate their knowledge. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is writing, using digital tools so that students can write and create in a creative way. I want to address the following questions. What are the tools that allow students to create and collaborate? And you'll notice the slide says, in a participatory culture. That's a theory by Henry Jenkins that we'll be talking a little bit about. And then I also want to talk to you about the writing that students are doing outside and inside of school, and how and why we might connect those. So first, I want to talk to you about the writing that students are doing outside of school, so we can see what they're doing outside of school, how that compares to the writing they're doing inside of school, and why we might merge those two. So this comes from a study of 712 to 17-year-olds, so adolescents, and it was done in 2008. And it noted that students are writing notes to others, they're journaling, they're doing short writing, creative writing, they're writing music and lyrics, doing multimedia presentations, and then the least type of writing they're doing is writing essays and writing computer programs. So what you'll notice about this data is that the majority of students are doing social types of writing. They're writing notes to others. And then these other bars down here, if you calculate all those up, 66% of the writing they're doing outside of school is creative writing. Now, if you compare that to the writing that they're doing inside of school, 98% of the writing students do inside of school is taking notes, not writing notes to other people, but taking notes on what their teachers say. And the other largest majority of the writing comes with writing formal essays. 93% of the writing they do inside of school is writing essays. So you can see that the social creative writing they're doing outside of school isn't necessarily matching the formal, just taking down what other people say type of writing they're doing inside of school. All right, hold on. So if we compare those two, this study comes from over 1,000 seventh grade students, and it looks at the writing they're doing inside of school versus outside of school. And you can see that the bars in yellow show that the writing that they're doing outside of school, and this is specifically focusing on digital writing. So outside of school, students are sending email, blogging, creating websites, and using instant messenger. They're doing a lot of digital writing outside of school, and you can see that this always decreases when we look at the writing they're doing inside of school. That's not because these aren't skills that we don't want students to have. In the business world and in their real lives, students are sending emails, they're creating websites, and those are great skills. To create a website, you have to synthesize a lot of information, and you have to present it in a way that's meaningful and relevant to a certain audience. So those aren't necessarily, it's not that we're not teaching it in schools because we don't want students to have those skills. We do want them to have those skills. So why aren't we teaching that in school? So one last graph, and then I'll focus on some strategies. So a recent study done in 2013 by the Pew Internet Group, which is a large research group in the United States, did show that teachers are using technology. But what are they using technology for? So you can see that 95% of the teachers report that they're having students go online to conduct research. The other largest percentages, 79% are having students download assignments, and the other are they're having students submit assignments. Now, Dr. Reinking's already talked to you about what type of use of technology that is. Students are going online, but not to create and collaborate and use their own voice, but here it shows we're using technology to have students just simply do the things that they've always been doing, kind of a teacher-centered approach, that they're going online just to access information that we give them. What we want to get to is these things that are the least used. And this is a survey of teachers that tend to use technology a lot in the United States. These are teachers in what we call AP, or advanced placement classes, and teachers that were in a national writing project. So these are teachers that are teaching the highest level of students. So these are overinflated results. If this was an average population in the United States, these uses of technology would be a lot lower. But we want to get here. We're having students collaborate online, to edit online with other people, and to post for an audience that's actually relevant, that's not just either other students or their teacher. Why do we want to do this? Why is this important to align the technology students are using outside of school versus inside of school? Well, a recent survey, 2008, so it's getting a little bit dated, but found that 49% of students reported liking the writing that they do outside of school versus, you can guess what the 17% is, versus only 17% reporting that they liking the activities that they're doing inside of school. So we want to get to getting them to have that spirit of writing and creating their own knowledge versus consuming knowledge, but we want that inside of school. And Henry Jenkins is a scholar that's been talking a lot about this. He's been talking about what's called a participatory culture. And on a lot of the tools that I use with teachers and with students revolve around this philosophy. So I do want to explain it for just a minute. So participatory culture involves these things: a learning ecosystem, co-learning, relevance, creativity, and motivation and engagement. A learning ecosystem means that we want our teaching to students, and here I'm specifically relating it to writing, but Henry Jenkins, when he talks about learning in general and literacy in general. But we want our learning to relate to students' worlds and their culture, their outside of school lives and their inside of school lives. So that's what I mean by eco-culture there, or ecosystem. Co-learning, we want students to create and share their knowledge with one another, but also it's an informal learning. The teacher has to take on a new role where there's a very low barrier to that access of knowledge, and the teacher isn't just the one transmitting all the knowledge. We also want the learning to be relevant to students' interests. Julie talked to you about making those questions really relevant and having students actually create their own questions. And that's a good example. We want the learning to apply to their interests. And again, we want their learning to be creative, and hopefully, if we have all these things, that their learning will be motivating and engaging because it will relate to their world. Now, I think you guys are already doing this a little bit. I looked on the university's website, and I saw and read a little bit about the Writers Network of Medellin. And here's what the Writers Network said their mission was: to develop skills and life skills through strategies for the creative use of leisure time. So you guys are ahead of the game. You're already doing some of this. But that's an example of something here in Columbia that seems to be connecting students' formal and informal learning, and specifically where they're writing, in their writing spaces. So how can we make the writing process more participatory based on those ideas I just went over? The writing process is traditionally similar across writing classrooms, but it involves planning in some way, drafting, revising and editing, and publishing. So I'm going to talk to you today about making this writing process more digital and more representative of our online learning environment by incorporating each step of the writing process with what we call Web 2.0 tools. And I'm sure that you are all familiar with this. Richard Beach defines this as tools that allow both accessing but producing knowledge in ways that move beyond passive consumption to active construction of knowledge, whether it's hyperlinks, interactivity, multimodality, or social networking. So all those things are really important in Web 2.0 tools, and that's what I use with different teachers. I use these tools with teachers in a case study this summer where I led tech talks with teachers. I basically introduced the tool to the teachers, allowed them to play with that tool, but then most importantly, I got the teachers' feedback on how realistic they thought this was. Could you use this in your writing classrooms? And if so, how might you use this tool? One of the first tools that we used was social media. Social media obviously is very popular, but we focused, this is a graph that tells you that 67% of the people who are using the internet are also using social networking tools. We use Pinterest, one, because it's a very popular, as you can see, it's one of the third most popular social media tool. But also we used it because it allows students to collaborate and create. Another reason we chose Pinterest was just because of its popularity. You can see this is just over a time span of 1 year, and you're going from 5 million to 30 million users. And that's on traditional laptop devices, but also Pinterest works across devices with mobile units. So what Pinterest allows you to do, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but when I was talking with teachers about Pinterest, I introduced it as a tool that they could use in the brainstorming process. Here you see an example of Gabriel Marquez, a great Colombian novelist, but how a student might get on there and have a specific idea in mind of what they want to brainstorm about. But here, this is representative of a digital space. You're not just seeing text on this pin board, but students are allowed to grab from all over the internet visual images as well as text and put it together in one pin board that they can not only see themselves, but they can also share with their peers, and then Pinterest allows their peers to comment on that pin board. Now, most of the teachers that I worked with in the United States had not used Pinterest in their writing classroom. But after I introduced how they might use this tool, the teachers took it and they ran with it. 70% of the teachers that we talked with said that they could use Pinterest in their classroom. But also, I introduced it as a brainstorming tool for writing. But the teachers had multiple uses for this. They said they could use it for brainstorming, but they could also use it for student feedback, so it allows that feature of commenting on each other's boards. They could use it to research topics or ideas for a paper, so when they're in that beginning phase and they have no clue what they're interested in, Pinterest might be a way they could find it. Sharing and obtaining information, so if you have students working in groups, they can easily, if they're co-writing a paper, one could search one area, the other could search another, and they could share their boards. For teaching ideas, many of the teachers were already using Pinterest to get ideas for their lesson plans. For publication of work or a final project, teachers like the idea of getting students to actually publish on these boards. And then finally, for book recommendations, specifically for summer reading or what they've been reading over this summer, instead of just sharing that in a traditional report, students could create a board of what they've read. Another tool that we used with our teachers this summer was Glogster. Has anyone heard of Glogster? Oh, one. All right, good. All right, so Glogster is an online, and it's a secure social media tool. This is becoming more popular. If you haven't heard of Glogster, you may have heard of Edmodo, but it's a controlled, specifically for education tool. And it's specifically for creating posters. It's an interactive poster. So it allows you to collect images, to use text. You can incorporate video, music clips, and you can design these in any way that you like. So it's a multimodal way to organize information. So I presented this to the teachers as a tool for students to organize their information. Here's an example of how a student used Glogster to create a poster, basically, about an author. But you can see it's not just text. They're putting text on there, but it's interacting with images. Here it's interacting with video. You could also use sound. And you'll notice that writing has changed. We're not just writing text on paper and reading it. Here, the student not only has to make a decision about what types of information to include, but how to arrange that information so that it's appealing to their audience and so that it's conveying the message that they want to convey. And Glogster has this great thing called, if you're wondering what Glogpedia is, as long as you're on there, they give you a ton of student examples that are free for you to access and share. So it's another way for students to interact. Another affordance of Glogster is that it works like a social media site. Once students have created their poster, they can simply click a button and share it with another student. And then those students, through the social media tool, can make their comments directly on the students' posters. One of the affordances of Glogster, again, that the teachers liked was that you can control, as a teacher, you always see what the students are doing, so you want to make sure they know that. But also that you can control how public it is. If you want to let them publish that to more people than the classroom, you can, but that's a decision that you get to make, and you get to talk about to parents before you do, and that sort of considerations. All right, another tool that's been mentioned in several of the other discussions that we talked about was blogging. And blogging can be used in the drafting process. An interesting fact about Blogger that I'll talk about is that students, when we're talking about integrating in-school and out-of-school technologies, students that use Blogger have been found to write not only more, but they write in a greater variety of genres, and they tend to be more excited about writing in general. Blogging is actually an international tool. This comes from data that looked at the percentage of internet users on top social networks. And what was interesting is that across the world, those social networks varied, but Blogger remained very consistent as ranking as a top social media tool. So in the US, 23% of social media users were using Blogger. In the UK, 22.5% were using it. In Brazil, 54%, over 54% were using it. And then in Australia, 26.57% of social media users were using it. So it remains a consistent, popular media tool that you might want to use with your own students when they're drafting or doing student writing. And actually, blogging has had some research done. It's hard to keep up in our research with these new digital tools, but there is significant research that's been done on Blogger, and it's found that blogging does, as I mentioned, connect in and out of school context. So 47% of bloggers, compared to 33% of non-bloggers, write regularly in their free time. They also believe that writing was more important, and they wrote with a greater variety than non-bloggers. Another finding from the research is that blogging was a motivational and engagement strategy. Because students had that immediate feedback through comments on their blog, and also that relevant audience, that's their peers. Those are an audience of their choosing that they're writing for, that they care about, was found across the research to be a motivating factor for student writing. Now, all of these digital tools are great and are exciting, but they also have barriers, as Dr. Reinking has addressed. Specifically, with blogging and all the technologies, one consistent finding across the research is that once we do actually do this great teaching and we bring those tools into the classroom, there is a tendency for students to say, whoa, this is my tool. What are you doing with it? So they tend to be a little bit resistant of teachers adopting their tools. So that's another consideration to just top of the workload that we're giving you today. We have to think about not only how to incorporate these tools, but how to do so in a way that keeps that student engagement and interest. And then there are the other barriers that we've already talked about. If you don't have the available technology, it's hard to incorporate these tools. And again, if you don't have the support for that technology, it's hard to bring it into the classroom. Another tool that we talked about with teachers for the editing and collaboration process of writing was Google Docs. Google Docs allows students to write simultaneously and to collaborate together as they work through the process of writing. You could use it with brainstorming, to editing, to revising, or publishing. How many of you have access to Google Docs? You raise your hand? Okay, good, so some. This is a free tool as long as you need the internet, but you also need your students to have a Gmail account, email account, so that they can log in and have access to this. But Google Docs allows us to do some great things in writing. It allows students to simultaneously write, and they can see what they're doing. It'll give you a little colored icon, and so I might be writing in pink while Dr. Reinking is writing in purple. It allows students to provide feedback, or teachers to provide feedback. In my classes, I often have to submit my paper as a Google Docs, and the teacher will edit my paper and do comments right in the Google Doc. Another great thing with Google Docs, if you are going to do a collaborative writing project and the students are going to submit one Google Doc to you, if you want to see which student participated and make sure that each student did participate, it allows you to go back and see the modifications that were made to the document, to see who contributed what. And that's actually been discussed in the research with teachers using that tool. So we're starting to see more of this being researched. Alana mentioned fan fiction yesterday, and I want to talk with you a little bit about this. And Henry Jenkins has a new book out, I think it was published in 2013, called Reading in a Participatory Culture, but he actually talks a lot in that book about writing. And one of the things he mentions is fan fiction. And if you're not familiar with fan fiction, it's when students use a popular storyline, either from movies or books or songs or animation, Japanese anime, and it allows students to in some way transform the storyline to meet their own interests and their own lives. So some examples, a student might take Harry Potter or Twilight or another really popular genre, and they might change it in some way. They could insert themselves as the main character, or they could change the plot. If they didn't like the ending, they could rewrite it. Or they might meld characters. So they might think, hey, that cute guy in Twilight and Harry Potter might be really good friends, and I'm going to write a story about that. So you can see that it allows students some ownership of their learning, some creativity in their learning. Now, where is this being done and how often is it being done? It's being done a lot. This is just a screenshot from a couple of weeks ago from fanfiction.net, and Alana mentioned a specific Harry Potter fanfiction site, so there's multiple fanfiction sites. But this one's from fanfiction.net, and I know you can't see. That's just a list of the different stories that students are writing about. So Harry Potter, Twilight, Lord of the Rings. But I just chose the top two, Twilight and Harry Potter. What I want to point out about this, just Twilight has 213,000 stories written about it. Harry Potter, just on this one fanfiction site, has 660,000 stories written about it. Now, these aren't just students doing it, it's adults too. But you can see the passion here. They're writing outside of school, and no one's making them do it. That's great news. But how might we bring that into the classroom? Now, I just want to refer back to that participatory culture and how this relates. You can see the creativity here. They're changing something that they've seen. You can see that they're connecting learning inside and outside of schools. They're taking their writing skills of drafting, publishing, they're applying it to their media they use outside of school, and they're co-learning. This is an active site where you can comment on other people's writing. You can give them tips about how you thought they should change their story. So here's a student example of how they changed a Harry Potter cover. So here's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. 5 minutes? Oh, I'm good. Okay. And then they changed it to be a fan fiction cover. So this is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. This student changed it to Julia Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. So here, this is just a visual representation, but she's inserting herself in the story. She's changing the story to meet her interest. And there has been, I know this seems like a very new phenomenon, but Rebecca Black has done a lot of research on this. And she found that there are benefits to fan fiction. It gets students to write creatively. They're exploring their identity and how they fit into these media genres of their lives. They're also receiving an authentic audience and receiving feedback on their writing, the very things we do in the writing process in school. And Anderson in 2010 also discussed that it got his students to synthesize their reading and write about it. So if you think about it, if you are going to write a story with characters from different storylines, you have to know those storylines, synthesize the main plots, the main points, and then write your own creation about it. One concern about the fan fiction is copyright. And Alana mentioned that this is a hot topic right now with many scholars, much smarter than I am, talking about it. But Henry Jenkins, when he does talk about fan fiction and his recommendations for fan fiction in that book, Reading in a Participatory Culture, does say that fan fiction has a place in the classroom, but we need to talk about copyright. We need to talk about the main point, and this comes from Jenkins, but also the Center for Social Media. Their policy basically says that the fair use clause under copyright states that as long as students are transforming a text, and that's what we want them to do, to transform what they're writing, not just or transform what they're learning, not just consume it, but transform it for their own purposes. If they're doing that and making their writing for original, meaningful purposes, then copyright with fan fiction is okay to do in the classroom. Okay, here's my references, and muchas gracias.
Mientras ella, ¿cómo se llama? Emily iba hablando, yo me iba divirtiendo y me iba confundiendo. Ahora, ¿qué voy a hacer? Yo con los estudiantes estábamos leyendo Lejos de Prim, de Luis María Pesetti, y ellos, a medida que lo van leyendo, para que conste que lo leyeron, que lo leímos, nosotros estábamos haciendo ese fanfiction, pero yo no sabía que llamaba así, solamente que lo estamos haciendo en la época de las cavernas. Entonces ellos van escribiendo Ellos se inventaron un personaje, general, son chicos de sexto, de entre 10 y 13 años, porque hay muchos que pierden el año. Entonces ellos primero crearon un personaje, porque leímos el primer libro, entonces ya sabemos de qué trata. Entonces el segundo libro ya sabemos los personajes. Se inventaron un libro, lo bautizamos, lo presentamos en sociedad y van narrando la novela, pero ellos le van cambiando. Ellos le van cambiando un poco como el argumento. Ellos van escribiendo con rojo porque lo que cambian, lo que ellos se inventan, lo van escribiendo con rojo porque yo les dije, hay que respetar los derechos de autor. ¿Y cómo vamos a hacer? Cuando el personaje nuevo, o sea, el tuyo, el que te inventaste, va a actuar, tienes que escribir con rojo porque entonces, eso no lo escribió Luis María Pesetti. Ahora, ¿cómo voy a hacer? Yo estoy admirada, uy, qué bueno. Ahora, ¿cómo voy a hacer para pasar del cuaderno a esa fanfiction? No, lo voy a hacer, pero yo no sé cómo voy a hacer, no voy a dormir aprendiéndolo a hacer, pero eso es un maravilloso. O sea, nosotros ya lo tenemos en la época de las cavernas, ahora me toca pasarlo al fanfiction. Pero, ¿cómo hago? ¿En Word o cómo? ¿Cómo?
Okay. First of all, congratulations for being a creative teacher. That's great. So there's lots of different ways to incorporate fan fiction. I would invite you to look up online what Henry Jenkins says about it, because he's got a blog and he has a lot of great ideas. But there's different social media sites like fanfiction.net, or there's specific sites with Harry Potter that you can go to. So if you just search on the internet fanfiction websites, they should come up. Now, although I do think fanfiction has a great potential, I just want you to be the great teacher that you are and monitor what your students are doing on these sites, because it's not just students on these sites. So just like with any digital tool, we need to be careful of how we incorporate it in the classroom. So you want to make sure you monitor that it's secure, and that you approve of the site and get permission to use the site in your classroom. Good? See? Yeah. Okay. It depends how you want to use it. So if you want to do fan fiction on a site where they can get feedback from other fan fiction writers, you would go to a site like fanfiction.net. They would create an account and they would post it. But there's other ways you can do fan fiction. You can do it for just your classroom and have them use a tool like Glogster, where they can insert text with pictures. Or if you have younger students, there's applications like Puppet Pals, where they can actually create a story and transform the ending that way. So fan fiction is really just an idea. It's not one specific tool. It's an idea of what you're already doing, but just doing that in a digital way. And the great thing about technology is there's not one right way. You can do it however you want, and it's great. But fanfiction.net is a specific fan fiction site. Is that okay?
Me preocupa que en las páginas de fanfiction hay mucho contenido escrito por adultos, jóvenes o adultos, que es contenido sexualmente explícito o con contenido de violencia, que no me parece apto para niños de 14 años. Entonces me preocupa, y no está tan restringido el acceso a ese contenido, a esos fanfics. Entonces me preocupa cómo manejar este tema con niños menores de edad, estudiantes de colegio.
Yes, see, that's what I was talking about before. It's good to be worried about these things and to know about these things before you bring it into the classroom. Like I said before, the people writing fan fiction has, just like any tool or any social media site, it's not just students that are on there. And although with some social media tools, we have ones that are specifically made for school, like Edmodo and Glogster, that give you teacher controls. Fanfiction doesn't have that I'm aware of yet. But there are things that you can do. So if you wanted to share a fanfiction story with them, you can just copy this specific link that goes to a story you've already read and made sure the content is okay. If you don't have internet access at school, you could copy and paste that into a Word document. So there's lots of different ways to expose them to fan fiction stories and give them examples of authentic purposes for their writing without exposing them to the things you don't want them to be exposed to on fan fiction sites. So I think you've pointed out a great concern and something that we do need to be aware of. Now, just like, and this is just in any technology with bridging it in and outside of school, you're not going to, if you get them really excited about fan fiction, and they're going to go on to fan fiction sites outside of school, which they would be doing anyways, and we don't have control over that. So that's sort of a fine line. But I would think, in my opinion, that's an argument for incorporating it in school, so that because they can get this stuff outside of school. So if you're a teacher who's taught them about it, taught them about who's seeing this and what voice they want to project when they're in those online environments, I think that's a good thing.
Bueno, dos preguntas. La primera, ¿por qué preocuparnos por los estereotipos o los personajes como Harry Potter, teniendo la Llorona, la Patasola, el Pañuelo, Pedro de Malas, las brujas, los cuentos de miedo? Bueno, y no nos preocuparíamos por derechos de autor, porque es tradición oral. Teniendo también, por ejemplo, las obras, los personajes de Ligia Bojunga Núñez, Pedro Vaquero, Ana María Machado, Asturias, Galeano, Poe incluso, entre otros. Y la segunda pregunta, ¿cuál es el papel de la mano teniendo en cuenta en la historia de la evolución de recolectores, cazadores, agricultores que iban desarrollando diferentes instrumentos y que eso le permitió el desarrollo de la inteligencia por la mano, por el uso de la mano? Entonces, ¿qué estrategias alternarían con el uso de las TICs para que continúen en esa cadena del desarrollo de la mano? ¿Qué estrategias pedagógicas? ¿O dónde quedan?
Thank you for your questions. Regarding question number one, of course, you should use stories that are appropriate for your culture, and you have amazing culture. The reason why I chose Harry Potter and Twilight is not because I'm a super Hogwarts or anything. It's just that those were the top 2 stories that were written about on that one website. So those were my examples because they were the most popular, and I was just pointing out the quantity that these students had written about. So I would encourage you to use whatever stories you want. Use whatever stories are representative of your culture, and have students rewrite those stories. And in a sense, all of our writing is fan fiction. Shakespeare took stories and storylines from other writers and made them his own, and all the great writers. So you have as many choices as you can think of to write about. And I'll let Dr. Reinking take your harder question.
Well, first of all, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I think, maybe it relates to the point I was making yesterday about all forms of reading and writing are technologies and have different affordances. We do use the hands on the keyboard, of course, but I think of the work, too, of Gabriel Solomon, who he made a distinction, and I think this will translate, between effects with a technology as opposed to effects of a technology. And so it's a tool that allows us to get something done. So there are effects with the technology, but the effects of technology are longer term. And so I think actually Daniel talked about some of those, it was Octavio the first day talked about how there are cognitive implications for the different ways we read and write. Without getting into a debate that I know I'm not qualified to really talk about, I think that, in a sense, it's a mood issue. It's the same feeling I have when I've just reviewed a manuscript that was submitted for publication, and I was reviewing it as a reviewer. And again, it was trying to compare the effects of writing with or without a word processor. And my comment in saying that I didn't think that this article, although it might have been a well-done study, it might have been written up very well, is that it's not currently an issue because nobody, no matter what research is done, is going to stop writing with a word processor. The affordances, the tools, the power that we have when we do that are so far superior that it's hard to imagine writing any other way. So whatever the effects may or may not be of various kinds of writing, there are other things going on that are more powerful that are saying, we're not going to go back or we're not going to change because this meets our needs. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but again, I'm not fully qualified to address. So.
El profesor mencionaba ahora unos inhibidores, unos factores inhibidores, cuando se refería al proceso de alfabetización dentro y fuera del aula. Habían unos ejemplos en los cuales algunos profesores, en su afán de ayudar, lo que hacían era frenar el proceso. Cuando un docente X se retiene porque lleva más de 30 años en el ejercicio y definitivamente decide que él no va a cambiar su estructura docente y que él no va a incorporar las TICs de ninguna manera a su proceso formador, ¿no merecería ser incluido entre los factores inhibidores?
It's not so much that I would say the teacher is an inhibiting factor. It's more that part of shifting, bringing the out-of-school literacies in school is a matter not just of understanding the technologies and all of the ways that it might be used creatively, but thinking about new ways for us to interact with students and our content. And sometimes if you've been teaching a long time, that's a very difficult change too. So maybe the greatest challenge is not just learning how to use the technologies, but interacting with your students and thinking about the way you teach your content in a way that is new and maybe if you've been doing it a long time going to mean some fairly difficult changes in the way that you approach things. So that may be, and remember the data I was showing illustrated that the teachers' beliefs are really what's important. And if they believe that this is an important thing to do, then they're much more likely to think about how must I change. And that can be difficult. But it can also be very exciting, especially, and this is from the study that I didn't because I wanted to give Emily enough time, the second study I didn't talk about. In that study, it was in a science classroom, and the teacher said she used inquiry methods. We used, let me tell you what the study was about. We had in a history class, middle school history class, students were blogging about historical texts, primary and secondary historical texts. They were blogging, and the respondents were teachers preparing to be teachers at the university who were going to teach social studies, and they were responding. And part of the intervention was not only this blogging, but introducing some strategy instruction to students. The teacher, it was very interesting because she was really excited about this intervention, but she didn't even know that there was something that was unfamiliar to her. And these strategies were new, and she kept falling back on her old strategies, and she just couldn't quite bring herself to doing this new. She wanted to. So we were doing this intervention for several weeks, and she kept saying, I'll do it next time. I'll do it next time. And we said, well, how long can we do this? So we began to look at our data and listening to what she was talking about, and we began to realize why she was having difficulty. She wanted to, but she just couldn't quite do it. So to make a long story short, we did some things. This approach, we shifted the way we did things, the way we approached it. And one day, she did this, and the students loved it. And she saw them doing things that she had never seen them do before. And that was all it took. One day, the teacher seeing the reactions that she valued in her students and seeing them do things that she had not seen them do before. And then it was almost like flipping a light switch. We could hardly get her to do it. And the next day she says, I want to do more. I want to do more. And she was doing this. And so sometimes there's that turning point, that tipping point where it's hard to do, but wow, look at what's happening with my students. And all of a sudden it gets a lot easier. Okay?
David y Emily, yo quisiera hacerles una pregunta que sé que despierta mucha curiosidad y mucho interés entre todos nosotros, ¿no es cierto? Y es, a ver, desde la percepción que ustedes tienen como investigadores, como lectores de lo que está pasando en la comunidad educativa en Estados Unidos, ¿creen que, a ver, digamos 20 años o más de uso de tecnología en las escuelas en Estados Unidos ha tenido un impacto positivo en la calidad de la educación?
One word, sometimes. I think it's not an unimportant question, but it's a matter of not just asking this general question, is technology effective or having a positive impact? It's much more a question of what are we doing with technology and what ought we be doing with technology. So any intervention has potential in certain circumstances. We're always looking, I'm not speaking for all education researchers. I'm speaking from my own perspective in relation to the alternative methodological approach that I described to you in my part of the talk. We should not, in my view, we should not be looking for what we call the silver bullet. Does that translate? No. It's the one thing that will solve our problems. This thing on average, this approach works best on average with most students. But your students aren't most students, they're your students. They're in a particular context. They're at a particular level. They come from a particular background. So what works on average, well, if you had to make a bet, yeah, pick what works best on average. But that's not the best way to go about deciding what to do. And so when we talk about, does technology work? Is it having a positive, I wasn't being facetious, saying sometimes. In the right circumstances, it does wonderful things. But doing the same thing over here doesn't work so well. It may not be appropriate. So, and it's not like technology is going to go away. It's just going to get more and more and more. And you can either get on board and figure out how to use it, or you're going to be left behind. And so the questions I think that are most important is how do we use technology in specific circumstances. And that's what our research approach, people will criticize it and say, yeah, but it doesn't generalize. This doesn't, what does that tell everybody? I mean, you've only done it, this is how it worked in one classroom, in one place. Of course, when we had the grant money, we did it in, 15 different places, and it was kind of interesting to see what worked and didn't work in these different contexts. But on that scale, we were able to find some things that almost regardless of the context, this seemed to be an important factor. But there's always an exception. And part of the problem, from my view, of education research, the way it's done, is that we frame it as prescriptions. The research says this, so you should be doing that. Instead, the way I approach research is, look what we've done and we've learned some things. These might be useful to you. Do you see the difference? And that's why I'm so invested in this approach to research. Because in the scientific, what we're looking for, the answer. Technology may be the answer, but it may not be the answer. It depends. But we can learn, as a researcher, when we go into classes and we learn how this works in a lot of different places or how it doesn't work, we come away with much better knowledge that's, I think, useful for practitioners. And maybe, if I can go on for just a few more minutes. I've been being a professor now for more than 30 years. And I subscribe to probably 6 or 7 important research journals. And I've been putting them on my shelves for 30 years. And I even got a back room that's got overlay. It's like my own little library. And I decided I have to clean up this. So I called the library. Do you want my journals? They said, no, it's all online now. We don't have journals. So you know what I did with those journals? I got a big bin and I pushed them all in and recycled them. And as I was doing that, I'm saying, look at all this research. 30 years, all these journals, all the time, the money, the effort of educational researchers that have gone into producing those journals. And all I'm doing is pushing them in this bin. And I saved out, I don't know, a stack about this high of things I had marked that I said, these are really important that I don't want to forget and lose. What does that say? What are we doing? We need another way to conceptualize the way we do education research so it's more meaningful, more realistic, more authentic for you, many of you who are in the classroom. The other thing that is related to this approach to research that fits that model is we work with you as teachers. We're not a researcher. Can I come in your classroom, do a study, I gather some data, and then I'm gone? We establish on a mutually informative, enriching relationship with you in your classroom. You become a partner with us, and we become partners with you. And we learn from you. You know what goes on in your classroom much better than we do. We're observers, participants, to help, to learn from you. I don't know how I got on my little sermon here from that question, but thank you for the opportunity to give